Well, the historical Jesus studies did not come with the Bible or with the Gospels. It was something that emerged later as a product of the Enlightenment. We noted that the roots of historical Jesus study come out of a skepticism raising questions about the Bible. How do you corroborate, and this is going to be a very important word as we talk about historical Jesus studies, how do you corroborate that what the Bible claims to have happened actually happened with regard to Jesus? That's what the effort was designed to pursue. And the history of the study of the historical Jesus really has been mapped out in language that's referred to as the three quests. Now, this is a vast oversimplification of what really has happened, but almost every piece you pick up that discusses the historical Jesus will use the model of the three quests in describing the history of the way in which the discussion has proceeded. I will use this model, but I'll also tweak it along the way to kind of give you a sense of kind of how it's a little bit of an oversimplification. It very much is looking at the three quest discussion from the standpoint of Europe and particularly Germany. But here's how it works. A little work called The Fragments, written by Reimarus, were written and emerged in the period between 1774 and 1778. That began what was called the first quest for the historical Jesus. That first quest period ran all the way to a work by Albert Schweitzer about historical Jesus studies that was written as a dissertation in 1901. So this is over a 100-year period that we're talking about. The argument of Reimarus and others is that the Bible, particularly the Gospels, was so overloaded with dogma that emerged later in the reflection of the early church and that had been layered on top of Jesus, that the Jesus of history was not the same person, nor did the events tied to him necessarily reflect all the same events as what was called the Christ of faith. So there was a difference between who the historical Jesus was and the Christ of faith that you read about the Gospels. Well, how do you strip away what the church allegedly added to that versus what really goes back to Jesus? That was the starting point of the quest of the historical Jesus, and what produced it was zeroing in on features where the Gospels could be compared to one another, the places where tensions existed, in differences in how the story was told, some worldview issues tied to miracles, the belief that miracles didn't happen, so anything that was miraculous needed to be stripped away. There were a variety of factors that were contributing to this in the Enlightenment period that led Reimarus and others like him to write slightly afterwards and to raise these questions in this kind of a way. It was a period in which the pursuit of the integrity of sources was important. That discussion actually predates the Enlightenment. It actually goes back to the Renaissance and Reformation periods in which European history discovered or rediscovered the idea of sources and authenticating them, the idea that some sources that claimed to present certain events didn't actually reflect those events historically, and how to discover that, those kinds of things. Those pursuits related to the pursuit of the roots in classical studies go back to the Renaissance and Reformation. Well, so Reimarus wrote his Fragments. This started a completely different way of studying Jesus. Some of the key ideas were to, as I mentioned, strip away the dogma that was said to come from the early church and that didn't go back to Jesus. At least that was the claim. We'll talk about how that works as we proceed through the events. There was the discussion of what became known as Lessing's ditch. Lessing's ditch argued that there was a difference between the Christ of faith and the historical Jesus. And historical Jesus studies took on the task of trying to get past the Christ of faith back to the historical Jesus, although Lessing's ditch argued that the difference between the two was so great that it actually was quite a challenge to be able to try and get back to the historical Jesus. And in fact, he expressed some skepticism about being able to completely do it. But that was known as Lessing's ditch, and it produced the distinction that often comes up in historical Jesus studies between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith. The Christ of faith is the Jesus you read about in the Bible, and you're making no historical judgments about what you're seeing. The historical Jesus, on the other hand, is the figure about which there is corroboration or good historical rationale for believing Jesus actually said that or Jesus actually did that. Another famous element of the first quest of the historical Jesus goes back to a man named David Strauss, who wrote a book about Jesus and introduced the category of myth in discussing who Jesus was. In other words, this isn't a matter of history, did it happen or didn't it happen, but also trying to figure out why we have the kind of stuff about Jesus that we do. And he's the first one to associate the idea of myth with things that are involved in the teaching of Jesus. Now, this is different than the mythic view of Jesus that we talked about in the first session. The mythic view of Jesus that we talked about in the first session is the idea that Jesus is completely made up in every way, every shape and form. There was no real historical Jesus of any kind. For a mythic Jesus person, the idea of pursuing the historical Jesus itself is a myth. It shouldn't be done because there is no historical Jesus to pursue. But when Strauss applied the category of myth, he used it as a literary genre and as a way of talking about certain features within the life of Jesus that represented exaggeration or embellishment or however you wanted to describe it. This was part of the way he described some of the miraculous elements of Jesus' life, that kind of thing. And he preferred that kind of a category to the kind of, figurative explanation you sometimes got in interpretation. For example, in the feeding of the 5,000. In the skeptical Enlightenment, some people held the view that what this really represented was a very poetic picture of Jesus so exhorting people to be kind to one another that what started out, as 5 fish and 2 loaves, or 5 loaves and 2 fish, however it goes, that what he did is he so inspired people that they all pulled out their brown bag lunches and began to share with one another. And that was the miracle of the 5,000. It wasn't really a miracle at all. It was just this kind of massive exhortation to be kind and compassionate to one another that led people to share what they had with the others who were present. Well, Strauss would have come along and said, no, that's way too rationalistic an explanation for why we have this miracle story. And he would appeal to the category of myth and embellishing a figure and making them look greater than they are as a way of getting at this. So those are some of the features of the first quest. Now, Albert Schweitzer came along in 1901 and went through the history of this quest for Jesus up to the time that he was writing. In fact, his book was called The Quest for the Historical Jesus. And at least that's the way we translate the title. And in the midst of doing this, he said, look at all the Jesuses who emerge from this study. We've got all kinds. There's Jesus, there's a thin Jesus, there's a fat Jesus, there's a circular Jesus. They're all different. And so he said that there is no way this is a good way to study Jesus if these are all the varied results that can come from that study. In fact, it's a criticism that's still used against historical Jesus studies even up to this time. The fact that you get so many different kinds of Jesus emerging from this study shows kind of the claim is it shows the worthless nature of the pursuit or the hopeless nature of the pursuit. We just can't even get there is sometimes the claim. Well, Schweitzer issued this kind of verdict that said a method that can produce this many different Jesuses has got a problem. There's another very famous quote related to historical Jesus studies that's associated in particular with this period, and it goes something like this, that what happens when a person studies the historical Jesus is they look in a well, they see the reflection of what they want Jesus to be, and that's the Jesus that gets produced by the study. It's a longer expansion of what was said, but basically you look into the well and you see the Jesus that you want. And so, again, it's a criticism of the first quest. And the effect of Schweitzer's criticism was literally to almost put a halt on aspects of organized, full historical Jesus study. In fact, the period from the time Schweitzer writes until 1953 is sometimes called the no-quest period. There was no organized questing of Jesus, trying to write a comprehensive overview of his life. At least that's the claim from the German point of view, because the belief was there was no way to get all the way back. The first quest ended with a completely skeptical attitude, not only about historical Jesus studies, but about being able to get to the original Jesus at all. It was a completely skeptical result. Bultmann, in writing his theology of the New Testament, spent 6 pages discussing the historical Jesus, basically declaring there's no good way to get back there, and then moving on to discuss the rest of the theology of the New Testament. That's how skeptical things were in the minds of some. And so this became known as the no quest period. This is the place probably where this 3 quest model is the most deficient in describing what actually is going on. There was all kinds of writing going on, particularly outside of Germany, about who Jesus was, the historical roots of what he was about, even some writings trying to place him in his Jewish context, that kind of thing. But in this presentation of the 3 quest theory, generally speaking, those studies are not so much picked up on. And I think the point that is being made by the claim of a no quest is there was no organized quest built around a method that everyone was kind of working with to do the study. People were just kind of each trying to do what they could in the area and leaving it at that. So that takes us from the first quest, from the beginning of the first quest, 1774, 1778, the late 18th century, all the way up to the early 20th century. The no quest period runs, when it's discussed, generally speaking, from Schweitzer's work in 1901 up to a lecture by one of Bultmann's students named Ernst Käsemann. I like his name. His name means cheese man. So if you're into mac and cheese, he's he's a good guy to think about. Käsemann was one of Bultmann's students, and in 1953 he gave a lecture on the historical Jesus issue, and he argued that the total skepticism of not being able to get back to Jesus at all is far too skeptical. And he suggested there was a way to strip away the layers of early church, particularly Hellenistically oriented theology, that had gone on top of some of the Jewish roots of what Jesus had. And if you could strip those things off, you could still get to a historical Jesus. And he argued for a historical Jesus who basically was an ethicist in terms of the way he encouraged people to engage God, who had a prophetic strain to him in terms of what he was about, in terms of what he taught and preached, that kind of thing. And this began what was initially called the New Quest. He didn't call it the second quest because you didn't have a third quest yet. So it was called the New Quest of the Historical Jesus. That lecture came in 1953, and the key way in which the issue was kind of sorted out was to try and strip away the Hellenistic elements from the Jewish, or sometimes called the Palestinian elements of the background of what we see in the Gospels, to get at kind of the original core. So it's like doing a dig through the layers of an archaeological tell and going back to the earliest period. That was the way it kind of conceived of itself. The second quest still goes on today. The Jesus Seminar that was so famous in the 90s is really a second quest approach to the historical Jesus. If you read their materials, they're working constantly with Greek backgrounds, Greco-Roman backgrounds, to try and strip away what they think is later. The premise here is the original Christians were Jews. They came out of Judaism. They kept their distance from Hellenistic culture. Hellenism came later as the church expanded out and moved beyond Israel and pulled in Gentiles. And so that was a later post-Jesus move of the Christian community. So the Hellenistic stuff's got to be later. It's got to be post-Jesus. That's in a really somewhat simplified form the outlines of kind of how it attempts to proceed. What's ironic about the emergence of the second quest in this kind of Hellenistic Jewish contrast is at the very same time discoveries were happening and emerging that would totally undercut the basis for this way of doing things. I'm alluding, of course, to Qumran and to the Qumran community and to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls did was to show that even a separatist Jewish community that was anti-Hellenist had a lot of imagery and reflection that reflected Hellenistic culture in it. That there was no way to split the atom, if you will. There was no way to peel off the Hellenistic layer and go back to the original Jewish layer. One of the more famous examples is the idea, the claim, that the contrast between light and darkness reflects Hellenistic dualism. Okay, that it's a later Hellenistic dualistic concept. How you can do that with a book like Genesis staring you in the face is a whole other question, but we'll set that aside as a problem. So the idea was that the light-dark contrast in dealing with the way knowledge is pictured in a kind of dualism is a very Hellenistic way of thinking. It's not a Jewish way of thinking, so it must be later. So they dug up these scrolls of Qumran, and they came across documents that played with the light-darkness motif and the dualism all the way through it. You know, documents that a separatist, Jewish, anti-Hellenistic group, sect reflected. And they said, well, that kind of undercuts the theory. They were right. A second thing happened during this period is a dissertation was written by a man named Martin Hengel, a German New Testament scholar out of Tübingen. He's actually someone who I have studied under. And his dissertation not only dealt with what Qumran was showing, but it dealt with how Hellenistically influenced Jewish culture was going back into the Maccabean period in particular and beyond. The Maccabees lived in the 2nd century BC. They were the family that defended the law when Antiochus Epiphanes tried to wipe out Judaism in 167 to 164. And he showed the influence of Hellenism even among these law-defending Maccabees and traced the presence of Hellenistic influence through Jewish culture from that period on. At least that was part of what he was doing. So not only did you have Qumran, you had this detailed historical study making the same point. And so the premises of the second quest crumbled in the process. This brings us to the initiation of the third quest. Now, the third quest was kind of sitting there rumbling all along the way. It was kind of, to use the words of that great theologian Chris Berman, mumbling, bumbling, and stumbling along, doing what it was doing as we were going along. And what the premise of the third quest is that the place to start with the historical Jesus is in his Jewish roots. If we really understand who Jesus and the disciples are as Jewish people, and we look at the social and cultural background that comes out of Judaism, we will properly frame who Jesus was. Now, in fact, there were studies that were doing this in the early part of the 20th century. There's a wonderful multi-volume work called Strachbiller-Beck, only in German, that went through the background of comparing what's going on in the New Testament with particularly rabbinic thought. Now, there's a problem with doing that because your rabbinic sources are later. But at least it was an attempt to locate Jesus in a Jewish setting. And those works were written in the 1920s. There were other people who were studying the background of Jesus against the backdrop of Judaism. German scholar out of Göttingen named Joachim Jeremias is an example. There were people in Britain who were engaged in this study. T.W. Manson is another name that sometimes comes up. W.D. Davies, trying to place Jesus in his Jewish context. But it really took off in the late 1960s. In the late 1960s, there were a series of works by a variety of people, Martin Hengel being one of them, Ben Meyer, a Canadian scholar, being another, a book called The Aims of Jesus. E.P. Sanders, not a conservative by any means, wrote Jesus in Judaism. He also tried to place Jesus in his Jewish background. And this laid a foundation for what became known as the third quest, making the new quest the second quest. Thus our three-quest model of how historical Jesus studies pursued. This was an attempt to put Jesus into his Jewish setting and to look at Jesus through a Jewish lens by working with the background of the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, what we were discovering at Qumran, what first century, what's sometimes called Second Temple Judaism, was all about. And this quest of the three quests that I've named, generally speaking, is the more conservative of the three quest approaches. The first quest is very, very skeptical. Remember, we got at the end, and Bultmann said when we look at it, there's literally next to nothing we can know. The second quest was slightly more conservative by saying there are some things we can know about Jesus, particularly about his teaching. And then the third quest came along and said, at least several versions of the third quest effort said, there's a lot we can know about Jesus. We can know what he taught, what he did, how it coheres, what kind of sense you can make out of it, that kind of thing. Now, it is true that from a third quest model, you've got people who are very, very skeptical about a lot of what Jesus did and said, someone like an E.P. Sanders, all the way over to really very conservative treatments of what Jesus said and did by people like Ben Witherington, Scott McKnight, Martin Hengel, Tom Wright. These are all third questers. The third quest is the area of historical Jesus pursuit that many evangelicals have dived into. My own work fits in the third quest model. So this is the third and final quest. The second and third quests run alongside one another. They don't, the second quest didn't stop and we picked up the third quest. No, the two quests really pretty much run together side by side. Different methodologies in terms of what's emphasized and what you're looking for and how to do it. And those conversations still pretty much go on today in quest studies among questers. Be a shirt that says questers on it. It identifies you as part of what goes on with historical Jesus. So those are the three quests. That's the outline, if you will, of what is going on in the pursuit of the three quests. Let me talk a little bit about historical method and transition back to that discussion. I'm going to introduce this and then we'll carry it over into the next session. I've already mentioned that historical method is not a perfect way of having a conversation about Jesus, but it is a way to have a discussion, particularly a way to have a discussion with a person who may not share a Christian's worldview. It's a way to get around the table and talk about stuff. And really, in some cases, oftentimes, not just for the believer to receive the challenges of the skeptic, but also in some cases for the believer to put their own set of challenges in front of the skeptic. So it can work both ways. So from that standpoint, it's an important conversation. The core to the historical method, okay, I can't say this enough, okay, so I'm getting ready to emphasize something, which means that it's important. That if it were on a final exam, I would ask about this. This is a way of emphasizing that this is really key, okay? The real key to the historical method is the idea of corroboration. How do you pile up rationale and evidence and warrants for the fact that this is something that you can accept? Okay? You're trying to undergird the credibility of the claim of the source. And the way you do that is through corroboration. I'm going to talk about the criteria of authenticity later, the kind of rules that are sometimes applied to these discussions that many scholars use. They're also debated, but that many scholars use. And one of the criteria shows this corroboration in really a clear kind of way. It's called the criteria of multiple attestation. It's done on the model, the old journalistic model of you don't print a story unless you have two witnesses or two sets of reports about it. Now, we don't follow those rules anymore, but there was a time when that was done. In the day of the internet, you print it before even God thinks about it. But still, in the idea of the way things work, the idea is the more sources I have, independent sources I have, testifying to something that something has happened, the more likely it is that it happened. That's the premise behind it. It's corroboration, pure and simple. It's a principle we all understand. We get it. We get it so much, journalists use it. I mean, that kind of a thing. So you can see that you're operating on a kind of plane that helps you wrestle with what is going on and whether there's a good rationale for suggesting that the source is actually reporting something substantive. So historical method is rooted in corroboration. The third key to the historical method that's important to understand about it is that it contends for probability. And I've already mentioned this, but it's important. It contends for probability. It's not slam dunk in most cases. There are objections that you can raise to the evidence that's put forward, almost inevitably. But the question that you're pursuing is this the more likely explanation or a probable explanation for what's going on, as opposed to being improbable and thus unlikely? And so the entire way that the argumentation is structured is to say, this explanation is more likely to be the case than some other explanation. The debates that you get into, for example, about the resurrection, you're trying to make the case that it makes more sense for the early church to have believed in a resurrection and that a resurrection happened, that some event triggered that, than all the other alternatives. The body was stolen, Jesus really didn't die, it was merely hallucination, etc. And you make the case for that. So it contends for probability. It's not slam dunk. That's why you have discussions about this stuff. That's why there's debate about it. It's rooted in corroboration, the kind of confirmation of information coming from you from various strands, or information coming in such a way that you can trust it. That's what it's looking for. It's not a perfect way to go, but it is a way very much for discussion. That's the way historical method actually works. And it is this kind of a method that comes behind the way in which the three quests have proceeded. And there's a whole set of rules, what are called criteria of authenticity, that have been built around the method to try and formalize how you talk about this stuff. As I've said, virtually everything that I've talked about all on the way gets debated by some people. Some people don't like the quest for the historical Jesus. Some people don't like the criteria for authenticity and where they come from and how they work. Because it's a process rooted in probability, it's inherently debatable. And you got to understand that about the way the discussion works. You got to understand the rules of the game in order to play the game. And so in this case, we're spending a lot of time laying groundwork before we even talk about events, because you got to understand the lenses through which the material is being taken in order to appreciate what is going on. Now, on the other side of the break, when we move to the next session, I'm going to look even more tightly at how this entire area is approached in terms of worldview. And I'm going to talk about three models of ways to do, in a comprehensive way, historical Jesus studies. Because the way in which you approach the question obviously is going to impact how you evaluate what you have in front of you. So we're going to look at that next. But here's what we've said in session 2. The history of historical Jesus studies can basically be summarized in three quests. A first quest running from 1770s to 1901, a no-quest period from 1901 to 1953, probably an oversimplified description of what's going on in that period, because there's still a lot of historical writing going on about Jesus and kind of where he fits by a lot of writers, but not in an organized kind of way. The second quest beginning to emerge in 1953 with Ernst Käsemann, where Jewish and Greek materials are kind of separated and stripped away from one another to try and get back to the original. And then the third quest theory, which is rooted Jesus completely in his Jewish background and trying to make sense of him out of the Jewish background completely, with the third quest being the more conservative of the three. We also talked a little bit about historical method. The historical method is rooted in corroboration. That is, how can I suggest that the evidence that I have in my sources has been confirmed in one way or another from outside the sources, how the sources were constructed or whatever. We'll talk more about that when we get to the criteria. And we've also made the point that this is not a perfect way to do things, and it's rooted in probability, so there's always, always, always debate about it. So on that note, I'm going to close the second session so you can debate it during the break.